Welcome, folks, to this week's edition of Tech Sales Advice. I am, of course, your host, Chris White, and this is the LinkedIn Live program for pre-sales professionals and pre-sales leaders. And these are live conversations. As I like to say, these conversations are by design, unscripted, unrehearsed, and unpredictable. And I'm excited for today's topic. I think this is a great topic to drill into. I'm joined today by a senior sales engineer with a company called HST Pathways. They're in the med tech space, if I can use that term. Chris Pompilio. Chris, welcome. So another Chris. Welcome, sir. How are you doing?
Yeah, thank you very much. Doing great today. Joining everybody here from beautiful downtown Louisville, Kentucky. Although I'm a California kid, but I'm out here for a sales trip this week.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's funny how we're back on the road a little bit. I'll be speaking at DemoFest in a few weeks, and I will be doing so from London because I'm in London for the entire week. And so after running workshops, I'll be dialing in. So great little town, Louisville. I happen to be a bourbon fan, so my wife and I actually spent a few days in Louisville, seeing some of the distillers. Anyway, Chris, we're not here to talk about bourbon. We're here to talk about gap selling and discovery and some of the lessons that you've learned on your journey. So, Chris, I introduced you briefly, but do you mind just taking a minute and introducing yourself a little bit more broadly?
Yeah, thanks. Absolutely. So, as Chris mentioned, I'm a senior sales engineer now with a medical software company. Didn't know we started out that way. In fact, not really a techie person at all. Kind of, in school and everything else. Was in college as a history major, and then ended up kind of not knowing what I was going to do after college. Had a girlfriend at the time, worked for a tech company. They needed some QA people, and I'm like, well, I can break a software program with the best of them, so I can do that. And started doing a little QA. It just fit that round peg, round hole, right? And became a QA manager there inside of a year, and kind of went from there to training and implementations was the next journey in the medical software industry. And Chris and I were talking earlier. We were a startup, but still at the time, and so we didn't really have a sales engineering team or solutions engineering team. So, as the subject matter expert, I was always brought in on sales calls to do now what I have the title for, right? And doing that. So, didn't think I'd be in sales. I know Chris has mentioned on his shows before. It's kind of like you feel like, hi, I'm Chris, I'm in sales, like it's a recovery meeting, but yeah.
Very well said. So how long have you been with HST then?
Yeah. So I've been with HST going on 18 years now.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. And so when you joined them, they were in startup mode, if I'm hearing you correctly. And you went from QA to implementation. By the way, as a history major, I'm trying to remember if I've had a history major on this program before. I think it's such a good indicator or reminder that you don't necessarily have to have a technology degree,
right,
to A, enter this profession, and B, be successful in this profession. So I think that can be really encouraging for some people who feel like maybe they want to break into this profession but don't have the technical background. And it sounds like in your role, it sounds like you were implementation manager, but because you were the subject matter expert, you were being brought in to sales conversations, probably giving maybe presentations, demonstrations, etc. So you were doing the role before. Now, when you actually moved into the role, was there a very specific strategic decision by the organization to stand up a pre-sales or a sales engineering function within the organization?
Yeah, there was. So I became the team, and now I sort of lead the team in doing that. They, as we grew and then, grew as a company, many more, sales executives and account executives. So we needed it was doing that kind of part-time, right? I was pulled in too many directions. So I had to pick one. So yeah, the company decided that, hey, we really do need to have this, the sales engineering team.
It's interesting. When I first got into pre-sales, there was an organization that I was speaking with, and their pre-sales their in essence their pre-sales team and the consulting team was one and the same, and they rotated between, like, in a given 12-month period, they would spend about 4 months doing training, 4 months doing consulting, and then 4 months doing just pre-sales. And that didn't appeal to me. I wanted to be just pre-sales. So,
Right.
and it sounds like before you made that switch, you were sort of split between the two. By the way, Chris, let's say hello to Brian Lewis. Brian, nice to see you, my friend. He mentioned to me, I think earlier, he said in the comments he was excited for this gap selling
Yeah.
conversation. So let's dive into the gap selling conversation, Chris. And in fact, for starters, there's probably some people that have a very specific idea of what it is that we're talking about, and others might have just a vague idea or no idea. How do you define gap selling?
Right. Great question. So the way I define gap selling, and one good book out there is right by Kumar on gap selling, and really what it is as uh, the sales executive, right? You're trying to get your prospective client to that future state. They're in a current state today, and probably a current state that is causing them some sort of pain, because that's why they're looking for a solution. You want to get them to that future state. That gap between the current state and future state is where that sale happens. Right? You need to identify that gap, and that's what you need to sell to. So that's really how I define it.
Yeah. And as you have developed the skills and learned gap selling, what are the specific skills that you've had to develop, and how is this unique? How is this different from maybe some of the other approaches you've taken?
Yeah, it's a really good question, right? How it's one of them, and we'll talk about a little bit, is discovery, or really kind of listening to the client, right? You have to understand what their gap is, right? What the problem is before you can sell to it. Yeah, and it makes perfect sense, right? People always think about that kind of stuff, but I like to, in the technical role, some people get more complicated than they should. Think of it as, if you're going out to a restaurant, you're hungry, you want something to eat,
Mm,
and when you're selling them, you need to know what they want first. You can't, if maybe they want a drink, do they want something to eat, do they want a steak, do they want seafood? You have to know that as the server. So that as a waiter or server, I did that years ago. You're kind of doing that discovery, right? When you're talking to the people, you're finding out what it is they want. And the skill set, I think, that is important is to understand. You need to, I said, get them to that future state. You need to understand what their need is. You may be enamored with a certain part of your software that you're doing, but if that's not what they're looking for, you can't sell them on that, right? You have to still find that what they want, and use that part to entice them, right?
yeah, yeah. It's so interesting to me. My background is enterprise architecture, and one of the things that we used to do, sort of one of the foundations of that practice is defining the current state and defining the future state, and then building a transition plan. And really, to me, this is sort of the enterprise architecture approach to selling, right?
Right.
Which is, and my perception, Chris, and I'm curious to see if you've seen this. My perception is that it's not just about identifying what the customer thinks they want or where they think they're going, but it's helping them envision maybe a future or a possibility that maybe they haven't even considered themselves. How much do you run into that?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, right. It's getting them to see themselves in that future state, right? And get them to figure out what that is. And then sometimes they don't realize, it's that analogy of the frog in the pot of boiling water, right? They've been in that water so long, they don't realize it's boiling around them. They're not jumping out of it. So to realize that, hey, you don't have to keep doing that. Here's a solution that can solve not only their biggest pain point, but a pain point they don't even know they have.
Yeah, yeah. How often do you find that when customers reach out to you, they feel like they know what they need, right? They're looking for a very specific solution, and maybe as you start to go through discovery, you realize that they're thinking about this too narrowly. Like they're not opening, they're not thinking broadly enough about what's possible. How often do you run into that, and do you find that it's a little bit difficult at times to get them to think more broadly?
Yeah, I think we're running into that a lot in our industry and the medical side of things. Because like, again, they have an issue or a problem that they're dealing with. They have a kind of a workaround they're using right now, and they're focused on that workaround. Is that, man, we could just stop doing this little piece, right? This little workaround that we're doing there. That's going to make it easier for us. When in reality, if you kind of back them up a little bit in that process and say, hey, if you start over here, you won't even get to this. You'll get to the end without even having to deal with that whole problem you're dealing with. Just doesn't exist anymore. So they're so focused on that small issue. It's like, no, we can bypass that at all, right? Like there's the word bypass, right? They build roads as a bypass to bypass the old. So it's not, we don't want to fix the intersection, right? We don't want to fix the lights. So there's anything. We want to just go bypass that intersection.
Right. Right. But by the way, Tony Franchetti chimed in. Sounds like acting like a trusted partner. Tony, well said, my friend, and good to see you. By the way, we also had it. I am not going to attempt to pronounce that name, but I'm going to say thank you for chiming in. It's like, and by the way, folks, if you do care to say hello, I invite you to do so. If you have a question for Chris or myself, please feel free to ask. Chris, Mr. Jason Zekowitz, let's get meta. What's the gap strategy to becoming a gap seller? Right. Very well. So let's talk about this. Great question, Jason. Let's talk about the before and the after in terms of being a seller. What does the non-gap seller look like in your opinion, Chris? What is either a sales professional or a pre-sales professional who's not really embracing this idea of gap selling? What do they look like, and what are some of the mistakes or maybe things that they're missing?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the non-gap seller, they may be an expert in what they're selling, right? So that's not a bad thing, but they're coming in and without really knowing that much about the client, they're kind of showing off their high points, the strong points of their software. It's, hey, take a look at this, and they show off what they think is great and everybody loves, whether it's a mobile app or something else, not knowing that the potential client may not even want a mobile app, right? They don't want it, so they're just not listening to the client at all, right? They just come in, hey, we're going to show you all this stuff. Right, all this great stuff. You're a car salesman. They're showing off the Corvette, and it's all great. It's, well, hey, I'm getting a car for my 16-year-old son. I don't want him driving a little Corvette. I want him driving a safe, car that's just gonna, get good mileage. So
yeah. If I may add to that, Chris, I think there's another. Another aspect of non-gap selling. It's almost the opposite of what you just said. So you said if we're focused too much on our own pushing our products without listening to the customer. I think the other mistake that we make is we almost, quote, listen to them too much, right? And they say, look, we just need a solution for this, or I just need you to solve this problem. So if we're not thinking more holistically, if we're not thinking of a trusted advisor, and let's be honest, if we sell, everybody knows most people know my golden rule of selling technology. He who buys a shovel doesn't want a shovel, they want a hole, right? So if we sell shovels and somebody comes to us and say, we want a shovel, it's very easy for us to say, great, let us show you our shovels, and let's just race to the finish line. But the reality is we may be missing the opportunity to help them on a broader level. And more importantly, for us in our roles, we may be missing the opportunity to help the team create a more strategic relationship and create not only a larger engagement, but a longer term client, and do more for the customer. So hopefully, Jason, that's and Jason, I love your question. So I really do think that sort of the before picture of being a gap seller is it's more transactional. We're focused mostly on products. We're looking for solving symptoms in many cases, and we're really just pushing product. So the gap seller is focused more on understanding where they are, understanding where they're trying to go. What are some of the challenges, Chris, in making that shift, do you think?
And making that shift to being a gap seller in
Yeah.
that. Um, I mean, I think we kind of talked about it a little bit, but just knowing what questions to ask, the client to find out. You talked about the shovel or the hole, right? What they're trying to get to, and those more leading questions. If their problem is, hey, we need a mobile app, right, for our software program. Okay, so why do they think they need that? Is it customer outreach? Is it is it better performance for their clients? Is it are they trying to track usage? Are they trying to do other things? And maybe there's a different way to do that, right? So that you can do things. So it really becomes down to that discovery, right? We're talking about before, and getting that information from them.
Yeah. Yeah. By the way, I love what Jason said. Non-gap sellers are transactional. Gap sellers are transformational. Really like that, Jason. That's a quotable quote right there.
Yeah.
Chris, some of the things that come to mind for me as well, and I'm interested to see if you agree with this. I think it's a couple things. Number one, I think sometimes we have to be a little bit more patient as gap sellers, because it's not a sprint to the finish line to just get our product in front of them. We really have to take a step back and be a little bit more patient going through the process of really understanding our customer. And in some cases, it may slow things down. The other thing is, I think sometimes we may have to challenge our prospects and customers in the way they're thinking. And that takes some courage, because the customer, unless we've built that rapport, right, the customer may not want to hear us challenge them a little bit and challenge their thinking. Have you ever run into that where maybe you want to tell something to the customer that may not be the most popular thing to hear, and yet you really believe that that's what's in their best interest?
Yeah, all the time, right? I mean, all the time, especially thinking of just a call the other day. We end up trying not to, but end up pushing or pitching, I should say, to physicians on the software, because they're users of our software. They're a tough bunch, right? They like will do things the way they do things, and a lot of times we're showing them the features, and then they'll be like, "Well, this is what I do today, so that's not going to work for me." And it is like, well, you won't be doing that anymore. You'll be doing it this way. It will be easier, because we have the experience, we have clients using it. I know in the long run it'll be easier, but to get them to kind of admit or see that, hey, things are going to change, it's hard, right? And sometimes you just kind of have to, like, okay, well, you can still do it that way if you want to, but this is what's going to make it easier for you. Or maybe like as you're done, seeing a record of what you did, or being able to instead of having to look through, for us it's like patient charts, instead of having to actually grab a paper chart and look through 20 different charts in a day, it's all summarized right in front of you on your device, or whatever it is. So but getting them to think differently about what they do is tough.
Yeah. Well, and it's a fine line, right? Because we don't want to come across like pushy sales professionals.
Right.
And at the end of the day, we do see things that they don't see, right? And it's hard, particularly like in your line of work, you're selling, arguably you're selling to people with literally doctor degrees, right? I mean, they are experts in their field. How are you, some software vendor, going to come in and tell me how to run my business, or how to perform in my expertise, right? You've never been to medical school, right? Who are you? I mean, do you feel that sometimes?
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Like I said, kind of fall back on just listening to them, right? Like let them vent, or and tell me what I don't know, what they think I don't know, and then respond accordingly. That it's interesting, and then you then can maybe come back with some numbers. Hey, we have, you know, 1,500 centers, surgery centers using our software. Thousands of physicians using our software today. They're all not wrong. They're all not struggling with this problem. So,
Right.
and to get them to see things, just see it differently.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm also wondering about the sales counterparts that you work with. I think we all know that sales in most cases they want to close the deal as quickly as possible, right? As they should. I mean, this is their livelihood, right? This is their jobs. And I would imagine that they might feel a little impatient with this process of discovery and really understanding the current state and painting a picture for the future state. So how do your sales counterparts engage in this process? And are there times that you're quote selling them on the process as much as the prospects and customers you're working with?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that it's sort of our company's kind of taking this approach, which is nice because then we have some of the higher ups that are just saying, "Hey, this is how we're going to do things." But you're right. Not only the AEs who don't want to maybe do that discovery call, or if they do it at all, or combine it with the demo, which you can definitely do. Um, but sometimes the clients don't want to do that either, right? They only have a short amount of time. I don't want to do 2, 3 calls. They want to try and get it all done at once. But typically, what we'll do is I'll just kind of take over the call a little bit if it is a demo slash discovery call, and start with those gap questions with the client, and what they're doing, and the client will people love to talk about their problems, right? So once you do get them kind of talking about how difficult their job is, and where their workarounds are, they're going to want to talk about that. And if you can hit a couple of those big pain points for them and say, hey, I got the solution for that, or I've come across this before. Another client of ours was doing the exact same thing you're doing, and this is what the solution was.
Yeah.
And yeah,
Yeah, really good. You triggered a question for me, but before we get there, I saw Jason asked another question. It's a really good one. Does a focus on gap selling enable a better handoff to post sale? So, do you care to elaborate on a how you hand off to post sales in your case, and
sure.
then do you find that gap selling enables a more clean handoff? Good question, Jason.
Yeah, really, really good question. In fact, we've just had this last week a couple of meetings with the implementation team again on the sales handoff, and we kind of struggle with that a little bit. Ironically, since I came from that side, I feel a little loyalty to that side to give them a good handoff. I think it really does, because the client, when the sale has gone through and it's a closed one deal, and then so you're handing it off to implementation, the client, you've solved their problem. Right? You've put them in that future state, and you've bridged that gap for them, so they're excited about being in that future state. So letting now you have that information from them, what their pain points were, letting the implementation team know that, so that they can start out with that too, and just kind of continue that same conversation and say, hey, we're excited to get you going. I know you guys have this issue, and this is what you're most excited about in the software. uh, Before that, a lot of times the implementation team would kind of have their checklist they would go through, and the client's all excited about it. And like, okay, so now we're going to do the table building, and we're going to do it. And the client's like, what are we talking about? I thought we were going to have this great software, and now we got to build all this stuff. So
Hmm.
they do, but to keep them on track, right? That knowledge is powerful to give that implementation team.
Do you ever find that the implementation teams feel like the vision that you've created is too aspirational or too lofty?
Sure, sure, right. There's always that kind of what did sales tell you it could do, and this and that, and We always try to make a point like, look, this is not what we or what we told them, right? We have one of the great tools that we use at our company for recording all the demos is Gong, right? Which is a great recording tool. If you're not out there, so say if you're not recording your demos and listening to them back and going through them, start doing that right now, right? Start doing that right away, because you'll hear things you didn't hear the same way the first time. You'll hear yourself do certain things and little affectations and the ums and all that stuff you don't want to do. You can kind of clean up that in your language, but it's just a great tool. But yeah, we'll get a push, that what is sales, sold them something it doesn't do, and now we've got to tell them without implementations is the bad guy, and has to tell them it doesn't do that. So again, back to that, the question, right? The gap selling and having that knowledge and what you told, letting the implementation know what you told them is key.
Yeah. Yeah. But by the way, just a comment from Brian. Yes, yes, and yes. Pre-sales has such a key role in prepping post-sales. Well said, Brian. And of course, Brian runs home run pre-sales, and of course, they're one of a few tools out in the space that are specifically designed to help organizations do this. Chris, what role do you and or your team members play in post sales in terms of ensuring that ensuring that the vision you created during the sales process is actually being delivered upon, or do you? Is it really just we hand it over, and then unless we're called in, we are not necessarily engaging after the fact?
Yeah, I mean, it varies a little bit between the sales executives. We are on the kickoff call for implementations, and we do keep a hand in with the clients. A lot of times it is the clients maybe calling the account executive if they feel maybe that they weren't the implementation isn't going like they thought it would. But I think setting expectations on that is just a important part, and definitely the sales executives still are there for their clients after that sale is closed won, right? It's not just ghosting them. Right?
Yeah, yeah. If during the sales process, if you've created, and for the moment I'm going to use the term co-create, if you've co-created a vision with the client or with the prospect, and there are certain things that they are looking to achieve that the platform doesn't support, or that the platform doesn't enable or doesn't do you have any process in circling back to the product team to let them know, like, so now I'm turning the gap selling conversation into identifying gaps within the product or within the platform that may be holding up or blocking certain deals?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the things that I like most about the position I'm in now at the company is I do spend a good deal of time with development with a product team on a weekly call, at least, on what's going on, giving them feedback on what the client's looking for. Because, a lot that's the information that we have as the sales engineer. I know Brian talks about it, and some of the stuff I've seen on LinkedIn. The sales engineer has so much knowledge from what what the clients are doing out there in the industry that you're in, what they're looking for. We know what the gaps are. So being able to get that back to product and say, hey, look, this is really what you want to do, because they'll over engineer anything in product, right? They're great at that. That's what they do. But sometimes it's the simpler approach. Say, hey, that's great, but really what the client needs is this right here. Let's focus on this one little piece and get that done.
I think it's so critical, and what you just said it activates my RAS, as I like to say. We as pre-sales consultants, right, as the pre-sales engineers, we have the direct insight to the clients and to the prospects and what they're trying to achieve, and the very specific thing. And you're right, I can't tell you how many times product would take a requirement and over engineer it or implement it in a way that maybe made sense in certain circumstances, but was so far from the most direct way to implement. And I think we have to take an active role in bridging that gap. a comment from my good friend John Busey. John, my friend, good to see you, sir. Thank you for the question. Chris P, what sales books do you recommend to an early stage sales professional? Now, John, there's no early stage sales professional. You've been doing this a long time, John, but it's a great question. So, Chris, and Chris, I think this is a perfect question for you because you spent a fair amount of your time in your career in more of a post-sales implementation role, and then you moved, you made that switch into a sales role a little bit later in your career. Have there been, you mentioned obviously the gap selling book.
Right.
Are there other books that you've read or other things that you've consumed that have helped you develop your sales approach and skills?
Yeah, it's interesting. It was before I really started doing this, more of the full titled sales engineer, right? We're talking about. I didn't do a lot. That wasn't the way I would ingest information, go out and reading stuff. I don't know why. I would do it for other parts of my life. Would I do some woodworking and things on the side, and I read, journals and things like that. But in my career, I started out not as a software guy. I was a hands-on learner in QA, and then subject matter expert in training and implementation. And it just kind of it all started clicking. So I just kind of learned as I went. But it's amazing to me as we do more of this. And Chris, obviously your book, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the 6 Habits. It was a great one. It got me to meet you and do this kind of stuff. The gap selling one, and there's a book, and I think I have it somewhere in my hotel room here with me, but it's the Go Giver is a good one too. It's not really strictly a sales thing, but it's just about kind of meeting needs and giving. It's a good one to go out there. So it's the Go Giver.
The Go Giver. I'll have to make. In fact, I'm going to make a note of that right now. That one sounds like I've not heard that one. The Go Giver. Awesome. You mentioned a few minutes ago, you said something about starting with gap questions, and that caught my attention as well.
Right.
Because one of the things that I spend a lot of time working through with people are the questions that they could be asking, should be asking, might be asking, not only to engage in effective discovery, but to help their customers or their prospects potentially discover what I call unconscious problems, or things that they should be doing but aren't, or flaws in their thinking. So I'm curious to ask you, do you have a set of sort of predefined quote gap questions that you lead with or open with? How structured are you in your discovery conversations, etc.?
Yeah, not too structured, right? I just try and like you said before, understand what their state is now. So it's those questions that aren't the yes or no answers, right? The questions are going to be a little bit longer. Is your current software working for you? Yes, no, or what is walk them through a typical day, right? You sit down. What's the first thing you look at? Is it a report? Is it a dashboard? How do you know what to do that day, right? And things like that, and let them start telling you. And I probably know what they're doing. I've been doing this long enough, and to know kind of what their day might look like. But I don't assume that I'm going to know everything they're doing. So I don't know if it's a set of questions, but just or asking about their biggest pain point, or kind of if you had a magic wand, what would you fix? By waving that magic wand, and find out that way.
How, as you have new people coming on board, how do you get them up to speed in doing this? I'm curious if is there a list of standard questions you give them? Is it more of just learning the skills of asking effective questions, tuning into what's being said, and then going in whatever direction they give you? Because, and the reason I ask this is I think this is tough for a lot of people. I've had a lot of
Yeah.
people come to me and say, well, Chris, I understand a lot of the concepts. I just don't know how to do it. Right. So I'm curious, how do you address that on your own team?
Yeah, it's a great question, and you know, one of the things, it's funny, I'm talking about me coming from implementations. We kind of have pulled from implementations a little bit, which I don't, that's probably why they're mad at us too, the sales side. On when because in my mind, like one of the people who are the best sales engineers for what our software we do were maybe the you know, the trainers, or the ones
Mm,
who were out there doing it, because they've they've sat, you know, shoulder to shoulder, so to speak, with the client, and kind of experienced the problems. They know what's going on, and and so can really tap into that. New people coming on, yeah, it's a tough one. I think in my mind too, and maybe it's not coming from a hugely technical background. I think understanding, you know, putting yourself in the client's shoes, in the customer's shoes,
mm,
is the important first step, and then what the solution is,
yeah.
right? If it can make them understand their current state, right, then you know that gap, what that future state is going to be. So
Yeah. Yeah. I value what you said about bringing people into the pre-sales profession from like an implementation role, a consulting role, a
yeah,
post-sales role. However, when doing so, there are some other challenges
yeah,
and some other sort of old habits that they have to, in some cases, unlearn. Have you run into that? And what are maybe some of the old habits, not necessarily bad habits,
sure,
but old habits that they've had to unlearn now that they've moved from an implementation? And you yourself probably had to go through
yeah.
this journey as well. What are some of the old habits we have to unlearn moving from implementation to pre-sales?
Yeah, so I'll talk about mine too, which is I was coming from that, you know, that the training background, is I fall back into training mode all the time
Mm.
during demos. Right, I still do it today. I still stop myself, and my AEs will stop me. Right, like I'm getting too far into the weeds on stuff. You might have can tell from this call a little bit when I start to ramble. I catch myself and I'll stop myself. But yeah, it's that you're not training them how to, you know, you're not
Mm.
showing them how to drive, right? You're showing them the
Amen.
car. You're not teaching them how to drive. So that's the hardest part. And it was funny in the beginning when I started doing this, and I would get that kind of feedback from some of the sales executives I worked with, like, "Hey, stop doing that, or stop doing this." I'm like, "Why? This is great knowledge. They need to know this. They do, but not right now, right?
Mm.
You know." And I see it now. I mean, I finally, a few years, I see it now. Okay, I know those mistakes that I made back then. So that's when we do get those folks coming over from implementations, is like, hey, just, you know, stay up, stay at that high level, stay at that 10,000 foot view. Occasionally, it might help to, you know, throw some of that knowledge out there about whatever that is, that feature, or, you know, how they would use it, a little bit of training. But I would do it without actually showing them. Just say it, right? You don't need to
Mm.
get on the keyboard and start drilling down into, you know, the settings of the software to show them, oh yeah, you can set up the permission this way. And who cares?
Yeah.
It's just absolutely, it's permission based, and you can, you know, it's highly configurable. Use those terms, and don't get into the weeds.
Yeah. Yeah. What I call the so what principle, right? For everything you're presenting or showing, simply ask yourself, so what? Why is that important? Right? Why should
Right.
they care? And if we don't have a good answer for that, doesn't belong. And I love the scenario you painted where you had maybe one of your sales colleagues saying, no need to show that, and your response is, yeah, but they need to understand that.
Mm.
And his or her response was, not yet. And I think that's the key point, right? The truth is people don't need to know everything there is to know about the platform in order to make a purchase decision, in order to make an effective decision. In fact, it gets in the way, right?
Right.
Too many details get in the way. And you know, as anybody who's ever spent any time listening to me, as I like to say, less is more. Less is more. Focus on the the critical few things that they need to understand about the platform. So
Right. Right. Exactly. Yeah. Take yes for an answer. Right. When you're talking about something with a client, or say, hey, do you like this? Do you see how this would help you in your, you know, yes. great. Then move on to the next one. Right? You've got the yes. You've got they've agreed. They're starting to see themselves in that future state. Keep moving. Don't harp on something just because you think it's really cool. And they get it. It's cool. They see it. So
Yeah. Yeah.
move on to
Indeed.
the next one.
Indeed. Indeed. So Chris, we've been at it for about 40 minutes. Believe it or not, the time has moved by very, very quickly. We've talked about gap selling, this notion of focusing, and I really do think it it has to do with our compass. And what do I mean by our compass? The compass works because it always points north. I feel like we all have a compass right here in our psyche, and our compass points to us, right? So if we're not focused, if we're not entering meetings thinking about and focusing intentionally on the customer, right, rather than ourselves, we're going to fall into the trap of just talking about our product and
Right.
trying to drive the conversation. So we've talked a lot about really focusing on the customer, particularly in discovery, understanding where they are, understanding where they're trying to be, and really presenting a solution that, quote, fills that gap. Is there anything else around gap selling that maybe you were hoping we touch on that maybe we haven't touched on? Have we satisfactorily sort of completed that part of the conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. And one of the things I'll kind of end that topic with, we've talked about that discovery or getting that information. One of the things I like, and I'm not sure, I think it might have been in Kumar's book, but talking about the gap selling. If you go out and you give the client or the customer all your information about your software product, whatever that is that you're selling, now think of it as weighted scales. You've just given them all your knowledge, your product knowledge. They know what their problems are. You don't know what they are yet. They have everything. They have all the information. They have both sides of the equation. They have your product knowledge. And you're sitting there with nothing else to show. Now that's it. So if you get that discovery first, or maybe as you're doing some of the demo of the product, now you have all that information, right? You're loaded up on your side. So that's really the importance of that discovery, right?
Yeah.
Is getting to that state.
Yeah. By the way, Amanda Bertucci chimed in. Great session. Thank you, Amanda. Nice to see you. Amanda is actually based in Spain. She's been a guest on the show as well. So we're covering a broad patch of the globe here, Chris.
Right.
And as you were speaking, something came to mind for me, and that is I want to double click on how difficult this can be, and particularly the busier we get and the more we go from meeting to meeting to meeting, I think the easier it is for us to just fall back into what I would call our default, which is our product, our solution, our features, our functions, teaching, training. And I'm curious, Chris, do you have any either techniques, or is there anything specific you do to sort of get your mindset right, or has this just become just natural and habitual for you to enter meetings where you're tuning in to the customer, or do you even find yourself sort of falling back into the the show up and throw up, spray and pray mode that so many of us tend to do from time to time?
Yeah, I definitely do that occasionally, right? And kind of sometimes you almost have to in a way, but I can always tell, right? You can always tell when, like, as the meeting is going on, if you're hitting the right points, you're doing a good job because you feel more comfortable doing it. You're getting a nice reaction maybe from the client. I'll feel myself, and usually I'll blame my AEs, but it's not their fault at all. But they'll bring me in, and I didn't have time to do any kind of discovery. I barely know, what in our medical, what specialty maybe that center does. Is it eyes? Is it orthopedics? So I'm just talking about, I can tell when I'm doing the demo because I'm thinking this is not what I'm showing them a case this is not what they would be doing, right? They don't even do that type of procedure. So even though it's exactly the same as they do, it's just I hate doing that, and I know I'm probably giving a bad presentation when I do that too, because in my head I'm thinking, no, this is not what they need to see. it does go back to, I forget which habit it is, but the click every click, or when you're setting things up in the demos to make sure things are working, and doing that right, and you're showing something that's meaningful to them. They're giving you their time. Be prepared for them, right? Be prepared for that meeting. It's just it's I hate when that doesn't happen. It's not good. It always amazes me how, you think it's a simple thing, like be prepared on the sales side, but one of my favorite, like, little quick stories, and I'll even shorten it even more. But when Nike came to pitch Steph Curry for his shoe, you may have heard this story. He was early in his career, so he wasn't the Steph Curry is now, but he was still, an up and coming player. The person from Nike doing the pitch mispronounced his name in the beginning. They called him Steven, and not Stefan. And then the shoe, they had a picture of his shoe in the presentation. It wasn't his shoe. It was another player's shoe. They hadn't swapped the slide out. So you may know Steph Curry is an Under Armour shoe guy, not a Nike guy, because of that. And it was a $1 billion mistake, right? To just not have the right slide in the sales presentation. So even the biggies make that mistake sometimes. So
that's brilliant. I have not actually heard that story, but that is a great one. I'm gonna have to Google that and look that up. I'm sure there's things that have been written about it, but it's a really good reminder that those might seem like minor things or small things. They're not minor things, right? Particularly things like getting people's names right.
Yeah.
To that individual, that's the most important word in their particular spoken language, right? So we need to get that right. So this might be a good way to close. I like to say that people buy from people, and to me, the skills that we've been talking about are so critical. Certainly this notion of gap selling, this notion of sincerely trying to understand where they are, where they're trying to go. But let's talk about the relationship building and the rapport building. Are there specific things that you do to make sure that you're creating some alignment on that level with the people you're dealing with, the people you're working with?
Yeah. So on both sides, my colleagues, and then obviously the prospective clients, right? With my colleagues, I always think of us as a sports announcing team, right? To use that, there's the play-by-play guy and the color commentator, right?
Love
and
that.
we take on different roles at the same time, but to understand that we know what we're going to talk about, or if I'm going to pause here, they know when to chime in with hey, did you show them this, or if it's a really good feature that we know usually gets some oohs and ahs, or it's a home run hitter. If I'm doing that part of it, and we're not kind of getting that reaction, if we're on video for in person to have them come in, hey, did everybody just hear that? Like that was, and hey, that was one of your Brian, that was one of your big pain points, right? You couldn't have a report that did this. Well, maybe you were look at your phone for a second, but you hear what Chris just said, right? To get that back and forth going on, and do that, and then I try and do that. This is funny. I do this all the time in my demos, and it came from another sports announcer for the Giants. That's at the Giants baseball. John Miller, who was, I think, out of your area too, Chris, right? For Baltimore.
Yeah.
And when he's doing the games, he has a little egg timer that he has, and because he's doing radio all the time, and he's assuming people aren't listening the entire time. So every time he sees the egg timer, the 3-minute go by, he'll give the game updates, right? The stat, the ending, the score, everything else, because when you turn on the radio, you want to hear it. So I do the opposite. Well, not the opposite. I have the egg timer for that same reason. And if that 3 minutes goes by and I haven't stopped to get a response from the client, I'll stop and ask them a question or ask them something else. So nobody wants to hear me talk for a long time. So if I've been talking for 3 minutes, I stop, ask them their question, or maybe follow up with, one of the discovery questions we had earlier, one of those gap questions. Can you see how this is getting you to that future state? So
that is brilliant, Chris. I love that. That may be about what we close in. Do you actually have an egg timer on your desk that you use? You do.
Yeah, yeah,
That's
I
and
do.
is it one of those you could just turn upside down, like you just flip it over and like bubbles or something's happening?
Yeah, I'm sure I stole it from one of the kids' games at some point just to use it. But yeah, it's just a little tiny one that I just flip over, and sometimes I'll look over. And I'm like, oh man, must have been out for a while because I didn't see it go down. But it's just a
Oh my
reminder
goodness.
to do it. So
That is awesome. You've just closed with it with an idea that I've never thought of, and I don't think I've ever heard anybody share. So that is a great idea. I may have to start incorporating that in some of the things that I do. So fantastic. Well, Chris, this has been a pleasure. Any final thoughts from you in regards to gap selling or anything else we've covered?
no, I mean it should like talk about other things too. It should be natural. You talk about people buy from people and that rapport, and you can tell anecdotes from that about. You can tell other people's anecdotes if you can make it sound like your own. That's fine, but be genuine and be passionate about what you're selling. That comes through on on sales calls. If you genuinely believe that it's a fit for them and it really is going to help them. That's why I like instead of working with product, working with the implementation and training, because I genuinely want to make people's lives easier with what our product is good that I sell. And I'm sure out there, folks on the call too, you're doing it for a reason. You believe in what you're selling, hopefully. If not, maybe you should look to do something else. But you really think it's going to make that other people's lives easier. So yeah, be passionate about it.
Such good words to close with, Chris. And I couldn't agree more. I mean, we need to believe in what we're selling. We need to believe in the problems we're solving, and believe in what we can help people do. At the end of the day, I do believe that to sell is to serve. We have the opportunity to serve the people that we are calling on and working with. And if we don't have a passion for what we're doing, I think you're right. That's our clue that maybe we should be doing something else. Well, Chris, it's been a delight. Thank you so much for joining. For those of you who are on, we've had lots of great comments. Thank you so much. If you joined us on the recording, thank you for hanging in there till the end. Chris, hang around just a moment backstage. I'm going to give you a parting goodbye. Otherwise, folks, I will be. I think I'm going to be back next week. I'm not sure. I think I've got some travel coming up, so we'll have some tech sales advice conversations from around the world over the next 3 or 4 weeks. In the meantime, be well, all. Thanks so much, Chris. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Bye bye.